Welcome to the Making Sense of Faith podcast. My name is Adam Hamilton. I'm the host of the podcast. And the aim of this podcast is to help us, as the title says, make sense of faith. Where faith, scripture, theology is confusing, to try to understand that. To ask questions about faith, but also to ask, how does faith connect with everyday life? And so whether it's politics, it's sociology, it's science, it's the challenges facing us in our world or in our interpersonal lives, really, how does faith make sense in those areas? So today I have a special guest who's going to be with me. He's actually going to be our interviewer for the day. He is the producer of this podcast. Matt, why don't you join us over here? I'm really excited to have you on camera for those of you who are watching, or at least on microphone for those of you who are listening. And I want to tell you just a little bit about Matt. So I love this guy. He's been a part of our staff for a number of years. He went to Duke University, and while he was dating, you were dating your wife at that time, right? It was before you were married. This is Chris, 2008. Yep. And we had just started online worship, and you joined us in that way. Is that right?
That's right. I was dating Kristen, and she was telling me about church she went to back home. And the cool part was I had a guy who was discipling me, and he was from a really evangelical background. And I was fresh off the heels of this conference where they were teaching that the world was created in 7 days, and that you're supposed to read Genesis 1 literally. And I'm dating Kristen, who's going to school to be a doctor. Mm-hmm. So I had these big questions about faith and science, and listened to one of your sermons, one of the very first ones, and I was like, oh, faith and science can work together. I want to learn more.
Oh, that's awesome.
Now here we are.
That's so cool. And you played baseball for a while. Who'd you play baseball for?
So 4 years at Duke, and then I got drafted by the Cubs and spent a small amount of time in the minor leagues in the Cubs system.
All right. And you tried to coach me in how to pitch.
I did.
You were actually a great coach, but I was a pretty lousy student. Okay, here we go. How did I do that? Matt produces this podcast. He's always behind the scenes, and he's teeing up ideas. But as we were thinking about the topics for the next couple of podcasts, I just wondered if Matt might want to join me. And you've got some questions you want to ask today. And what's our topic for the day?
The topic for today is, how do we read the news? Like, how do we find truth in all of the noise?
Yeah.
And I'm excited because I'm trying to read the news every day.
Yeah.
I know you're trying to pay attention to the news. Yeah. And so the first question to kind of get us started is, when we have the news everywhere all the time, algorithms, social media feeds, 24/7 news, how does that impact? How do you see people being impacted either in the church or outside of the church when they're constantly plugged into the torrent of news coming at us?
Right. So, and this is a huge change that's happened since I was a kid. So when I was a kid, the news was on in the evening. You had a 5 o'clock and you had a 5:30, or you had 5:30 and 6 o'clock. And that was it. You had, the newspaper came out. It came out at one point in Kansas City. We had the Times and the Star. So Kansas City Times came out in the morning, Kansas City Star in the evening. You know, that news was already 12 hours old by the time you got it in the newspaper. And you know, we all were interested in news. A lot of people subscribed to the newspaper, but we didn't have news all the time. And such a huge difference. Somewhere along the way, news became entertainment. Mm-hmm. News became a massive, money-making machine for people to be able to draw people in. Headlines that are going to get you to click, so clickbait. None of that existed before. And so as I was trying to think back, when did news become such a big part of our lives? And at least it happened before this. So it happened when, you had CNN and you had Fox creating news, 24-hour news channels. But I think it was with the major events like 9/11. I don't know that I was, maybe after a big event, you might watch the news for a bit more. But 9/11, it was a constant, we were constantly watching to see after 9/11. I'm sure it happened before that, but that's when it comes to my mind. And we just wanted to know more. We wanted to know more. And so you're turning on the news at night when you wake up in the middle of the night. You're turning it on first thing in the morning. You're looking throughout the day. And then we have, as the internet, the internet was already around, but as apps come up for us to be able to get news in our news feeds or social media, so that, in X, you were getting at one time 140 characters worth of news. How much news can you get in 140 characters? But, and so at some point we become, I won't speak for other people. I became addicted to news, and I find that still. I've had to say this is not healthy. Going to bed at night and doom scrolling through all the news feeds. I'm not a big social media, like, I'm on X all the time, or Facebook, seeing what's happening in people's lives. I use those, but the news, my Apple News feed, the New York Times, Wall Street. I subscribe to several different sources. and then I find I can't sleep after I'm doing that, or I wake up in the middle of the night doing the same thing, or throughout the day. And, when I pull up, Safari to do searches, my homepage is the New York Times, or, so it's just that constant thing. And then again, to get me to click, there's got to be a salacious headline. There's got to be something that sounds pretty salacious.
So as this podcast is called Making Sense of Faith, and some listeners are pursuing faith, some are exploring. As somebody who's pursuing faith and the Christian faith, why should we care about the news?
Yeah. Well, I think the news is something we have to care about, because to the degree that it's trying to accurately capture what's happening in the world, our faith is about how do we live out our faith in the world. So, I want to watch the news. I don't want to totally set it aside. I know people who've said, I'm not even watching the news anymore at all. Well, I don't want to do that. But at the same time, there's news overload, and there's also a recognition that there are no completely unbiased sources. I mean, as hard as we try, I try to be really unbiased, but I have biases. Everybody has biases. And because we live in a day and time when news is entertainment, there are, especially for certain news sources on both the left and the right, you're going to hear the news primarily through a particular vantage point aimed at building an audience that's in a certain place on the political and sociological or even theological spectrum. So we've got to keep watching the news, though. We've got to be aware of what's happening in our world. But I think for many of us, we've become overconsumed and over-consuming the news.
So one of the things you've talked about on podcasts and sermons is the greatest commandment, our call to love God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And part of that mind, I've heard you talk about what loving God with your mind looks like in critical thinking. Could you walk us through what does it look like to love God with our minds and how that might help us?
Sure. And it's so interesting because if you go back to Deuteronomy 6:5, which is where the great commandment is found, 6, 4, 5, 6, this passage. In Deuteronomy 6:5, Moses, on behalf of God, says we're to love God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our strength. I think that's how it's worded. And Jesus changes that in Matthew chapter 20. He says, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. So instead of strength, he says mind. The Greek word for mind, now Jesus is speaking Aramaic, but when Matthew is translating whatever Jesus said into Aramaic, or into Greek, he uses the word dianoia. And dianoia is to think through. And so it's interesting, another English translation of the word dianoia is critical thinking. So Jesus says we're to love God with our heart, we're to love God with our soul, with our entire being, but we're to love God with our critical thinking skills. And so this becomes particularly important when it comes to the news, or really anything that's happening around us, we're asking. But I think when it comes to news, we have to be able to ask, is this accurate? What is the bias, or what is the vantage point in which this is being presented? Is it capturing all the truth, or only half the truth, or part of the truth? And so we've got to love God with our mind when it comes to how we consume or how we watch and look at what's happening in the world around us.
Do you think, how is critical thinking a spiritual practice for us? Like why is that important? How is that actually living out and acting out our faith when we're really pursuing critical thinking?
Well, let's just take an example that has nothing to do with the news, but let's just say that a friend of yours tells you about another friend something that's salacious about them, something that may or may not be true. And you hear that, and either you believe it, and then you got to figure out what do I do about it, or you go, maybe I should find out if that's actually true. Because a lot of times what we get, even from our friends, is half-truths. It's sort of like that game we used to play when we were kids where you'd whisper in one person's ear and they would whisper in another person's ear, and you'd go through the classroom. The teachers would do this as a way of teaching us not to do it, but you'd go all the way through the classroom. By the time you get to the end, it didn't sound anything like what you heard in the beginning. And that's part of what happens when it comes to gossip, when it comes to sharing information. And so the ability to go, I really should just check to make sure. And especially I find if something is really in the news, if something is really, you hear it and you go, I can't believe that happened. And you get really angry and upset about it. And, I learned this a long time ago. Don't immediately post on social media your response to some news story until you've done two things. Wait a little while to see if that's the whole story. And then make sure you've done your research to see, what was the context? What do I know about this person? And I've found this many times where with social media, when we first started embracing X or Twitter and then Facebook, and something would happen in the news, then I would feel like, oh, I should say something about this in response. And I learned very quickly that if you waited a day, the story often sounded different the next day. And so that ability both to take time and then to research and look at other sides of the story. I find this, I was sitting in the waiting room I was sitting in a hospital waiting room, and they had Fox News on the big screen there. And I'm by myself, and I'm watching this, and I'm listening to the stories being told, and I'm like, wonder if that's entirely accurate. And again, it sounded just kind of crazy. And so then I started doing some research, and I found like, oh, that's really not the whole story. There's another part of the story. Same exact thing happens sometimes in MSNBC or CNN, is you're going to hear the story told from a certain vantage point, and they've only got 2 minutes to tell the story. It's never the whole story in what you're hearing. So the ability on my phone, I have the news apps that I subscribe to. I subscribe to the New York Times, a Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal tends to be a bit more on the conservative side. New York Times a bit more on the progressive side. Sometimes way more, but sometimes just a bit more. I've got Fox News. And I think I have one more. I can't remember what it is. But these are the four. Either I subscribe to these sources or I follow these sources. And I find when there's something, even if we have confirmation bias. So I have this bias already, and then I'm looking for news sources that confirm that. And then I get really good and mad because I hear the story that agrees with what I think about. But again, if I take the time to go, well, let's look at the whole thing, and I listen to the other side of the story, sometimes it's not quite as clear and as aggravating as what I first heard on the news source that agrees with my own biases.
Absolutely. You mentioned that you have multiple news sources that you go to from multiple angles, and what I have in my notes is the manipulation machine. And you mentioned this earlier, but with algorithms, they're like news companies, entertainment news, it's competing for our attention. And the way they compete for our attention is there's manipulative tactics in there. There's psychological triggers and factors. So here's my question for generally, and then also for you. How can you tell the difference for you when you feel like you're being informed versus being manipulated? And then also, just to bring it to like at the time we're recording, there's a lot of coverage on the No Kings protest recently.
Yeah.
And so could you talk about how do you guard yourself from being manipulated but also staying informed? And then maybe an example of what you've seen in the last couple of weeks with the coverage.
Yeah. So I think when you see headlines that are immediately aimed at giving registering a response, an emotional response, I'm going to be a bit careful about that. And again, I say, okay, that's okay. I understand how this works. I understand that these headlines are clickbait aimed at trying to get me to click. And sometimes I'm going to do it. And but if I'm going to do it, then I want to look down. And often the headline is the most salacious part of the story. Everything else is pretty mundane, with that headline. Yeah. And then a couple things that are helpful for me is, I try to ask, does this fairly and accurately, like if this person who the story is about were here, how would they describe their motivation, why they did what they did, what they actually did? And it doesn't mean that the news story is wrong. It may very well be right, but at least to know there might be another side to that story. That's helpful for me in kind of dialing down my immediate anger and rhetoric, or anger and tendency to comment on it. And at the same time, there are a lot of things that are happening in our world today that are disconcerting. Mm-hmm. And, and I'm not just talking Republican or Democrat or right and left. There are things that people do and you go, I can't believe that happened. What were they thinking? Or, criminal acts, or certainly when it comes to our government, we're, the type of leader that President Trump is. So more of an autocratic, I see what needs to happen, and I think often the motives are probably, not always, but often the motives may be the right motives. Like, I want to fix things. Mm-hmm. I'm a fixer. I want to fix things. I want to solve things. And yet he may not have all the truth. He's having the truth, he has the truth from a certain vantage point. He has his own biases. He's hearing those biases, like that Portland is in a, is a terrible state of meltdown in Portland, and then you go to the news cameras in Portland and you go, well, wait, they're buying donuts at, Voodoo Donuts. They're where's all the horrible things that are happening that need troops to be sent in? Well, the president's also a consumer of news, and he has his favorite news sources, which he's not afraid to tell us about, and he has people advising him. And so, again, the importance of being able to hear both sides. I would wish that more, in the White House and those who are advising the White House. I feel like right now where we have is a whole lot of people who are in a very similar place. So I think there are times where the president will, he'll have an executive order, or he's going to do something, and you read about that and you go, I can't believe he'd do that, and then it. Again, you can begin to attribute motivation for why that's happening. He's going to try to he's going to become a king. He's going to try to, whatever it might be. And that ties in with the biases of people on the other side. And so I think the ability to go, I'm going to give, whether you agree with this or not, whether it's the president or something else, but I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt, or at least I'm going to try to understand what's motivating this person, what might be the positive things that are motivating this person. It doesn't mean I agree with what they did. I may very well say, okay, I understand where you were coming from, but we can't do it this way. And but anyway, I think that's the critical thinking, and that's trying to understand the other side. Now, I wrote a book a number of years ago called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White. It was thoughts on religion, morality, and politics. And in it, this is the book, in it, I was trying to recognize that in many cases, things that deeply divide us as Americans or as Christians, that there's some truth on both sides of that we have a lot of people who see the world in black and white terms. When you see the world in black and white terms, either or world, it's, you're either good or you're bad. You're either evil or you're righteous. Everything is true or it's false. That doesn't actually capture how most things are. Some things are black and white. Abusing children is always wrong. There's just there's no gray in that. Mm-hmm. But there's a whole lot of things in which either A, if we try to understand the person on the other side, we can find some common ground, even if we continue to disagree with them on a variety of places. And I feel like that critical thinking leads us to ask, what's motivating this person on the other side? Why do they hold those particular views? It's becoming curious, right? It's if I can be curious, then I might be able to understand. Then I might be able to be in a relationship with you where we can have a conversation that could positively influence me and you. I have to be willing to go, I could be wrong about this. And that, I think, is a healthier way than where we are today, which is I listen to sources of news that confirm my biases. I don't take the time to find out if there's any truth on the other side or the motivation. And then I fire away with comments on social media or, with actions. And so all of that's a way of saying this idea of critical thinking, of loving God with our mind, includes trying to understand other people and being curious when it comes to their positions. And it may still lead us, when we get curious and sometimes we find out, that was a really bad actor and that person's doing some horrible things and we got to speak up against it. But at least we took the time to do the research and understand it.
So you started Church of the Resurrection in 1990, so 35 years ago. And obviously there was news before 1990, but you've seen the internet was around, but you've seen the internet grow, you've seen social media, you've seen the news evolve. Do you think it's harder today for people to engage with the news and not get drawn in emotionally than it was 35 years ago? Or do you think it's we just hear about it more because of the 24/7 news?
Well, I think the 24/7 news we become almost addicted to this, and we need our fix, and we keep scrolling to find something new that we didn't already know. I think that can play a role in the voices that we have, and the fact that as opposed to, when I was a kid growing up, if you watch the evening news, the aim was to try to be somewhat balanced and fair. I think that's still the aim, actually, when I watch the news today. It's easy for people to slam, some of the major news sources. But I think I watch the evening news, and generally there's some positive stories that are meant to uplift. There's some, serious stories that are, here are some serious concerns. But again, they may be told, the language is interesting, how it can lead us one direction or another in terms of our conclusions. But I think today, We are inundated by the news. We know more than we've ever known before as things are happening immediately wherever it is around the world. And we are so polarized already that goes into how we're hearing and understanding the news. I think we have to be really intentional about saying, I'm not going to shoot first and ask questions later, whether it's social media posts or whatever, but instead I'm going to try to understand and to understand why. So let's just say President Trump. This morning on the news, when I was looking at my news feed before, so I start with my morning devotions, then I look at the news feed, and it was a map of how Americans are feeling about the president right now, and again, even the polls. Who's conducting the poll? How did they ask the questions? Right. So I take all of that with a grain of salt, but it shows that there's a large number of people for whom there's a large number of people who are strongly supportive of President Trump no matter what. And then you've got a large number of people who are saying, and a little bit larger number of people today saying, we're concerned. We feel like there's ways of, the president is acting, things that the president has done that we have questions about. And so we're deeply divided, and those divisions go into how we're listening to, who we're listening to, how we're listening to the news, and what we're doing about it.
So You've mentioned this from different angles, but I want to drill deeper. So for you personally, like your personal strategies, you see something on the news, you see it from multiple angles, you recognize that the source is trying to bring it from a certain perspective. How do you guard your heart so that whether you're reading the news, whether you're talking about the news with somebody that you disagree with about something really important to you, how do you guard your heart so that you don't let that make you think about this other person in a way that Jesus wouldn't want us to think about him? Like, how do you do that?
I think that's such a great question, because I think where, committed Christians can find themselves hating as a result of hearing the news. And by the way, I think I want to say this, I think one of the highest callings in life today is to be a journalist. Mm-hmm. And we have a number of journalists in our congregation. I'm so proud of them, and they're trying to present the news. They're trying to do research. They're trying to really dig in and to understand both sides of an issue, and then to present, to help us understand it. And sometimes to be able to say, this is something we should be concerned about. We need to be worried about this. I think that's such an important calling. And in a day and time when people are, use the term fake news to describe journalism and the news, I don't think the journalists that I know from Resurrection on television as well as in print are some of the most remarkable people doing such important work. I'm really proud of them for the work they're doing in a very difficult time. And what is you're going to write an article, and there's going to be X number of people who are going to hate you for it, or going to maybe even offer, rarely, but know it happens, death threats because you wrote this article or you did this piece. So going back to how do you guard yourself from hating, I think is really the question in my mind. So you have to remember, the central Christian ethic is the call to agape, the call to love. It's not a call to have warm, fuzzy feelings for people. It's a call to wish the best for other people, a call to do the right thing towards other people. And the right thing is never going to be hating. So when it comes to, the feelings that are evoked in the midst of all this, I have to remember, even if it's an issue that I'm really disappointed or upset about, or, that I think is wrong, I can speak about that thing as being wrong. I can even speak about the people who are making what I consider bad decisions, but I will not hate them. And I played in a sermon not long ago a clip from Sonia Warshawski, who was a Holocaust survivor. And she's just turned 100 this year. I love this woman. And she talked about the Nazis, and she said, I can't forgive them because I wasn't the one who was killed. That would be the people who, even though she lost her family in the Holocaust, she said, I won't forgive, but I will not hate. I choose not to hate. And I think that's so important. And this also has to do with people. So I was thinking about the No Kings protests recently. And I was looking at, there was a news story, and the news presented the No King, presented in a pretty objective way why people are out there protesting what they were saying. And then I read all the comments on the social media feed that people wrote, and the vitriol and the anger and the hatred. And there are people who are feeling like, they're assuming certain things about the No Kings protesters, and then some who were supporting the No Kings who were writing vitriolically towards these other folks, and in the middle of that, to be able to say, I don't agree with you, and I think that you're wrong, but I still love you. I am still called to wish for good for you. I'm still called so that we can disagree, but I'm not going to hate you, and I'm going to try to see the good in you, and ultimately, actually, the people who are protesting, the No Kings protesters, which a number of them were resurrection people. I love, there was anyway, I was driving by we were doing Serve Saturday. And so I was out serving going to visit different serve places where people were serving. But then I saw there was a number of people with the resurrection t-shirts on out there. And I thought this is, and I waved at him and hey, Pastor Adam, I was in my convertible and Pastor Adam, my 2013 Mustang. And I was proud of them for speaking up and standing up for what they believed was right, but in a way that was positive. The signs that I saw were not hateful; they were positive. They were, they were out there having fun, but they were saying, "Look, we're worried about what's happening to our democracy." And I know at the same time that there are a certain percentage of Resurrection members who would be angry that their fellow Resurrection members are out there protesting. And what I want them to be able to do is go, you know what? We're brothers and sisters in Christ, and I may disagree with you about how you see the president or how you assess what the president's done. But you're still my brother or sister in Christ, and we can disagree and love each other. And you know what? You're probably right about some things. Mm-hmm. I think that's the other thing, is the ability to say, when you actually dig in. I've found when I've met with people that I had strong disagreements about, but we sat and talked, we found that we actually agreed on a whole lot more than we disagreed on. And we were going to walk away disagreeing, but we were also going to understand each other better. And I think that's something that's lost too in our society today, is the ability to listen to people and try to understand where they're coming from. That, some people say, well, that's, that means you're middle of the road. You're never really going to take a stand. No, you can take a stand. Mm-hmm. But when you take a stand, you can take a stand and say, look, I think this is wrong. I believe this is wrong. And I understand where people are coming from on this other side, and I still love them. And I think we've got to be able to reclaim that.
So two more questions here as we start to wrap up. So we've talked about, practical tips and strategies. We've talked about multiple sources from multiple angles, talked about asking questions before you post, the call to agape love, and wanting the best for somebody even when you disagree with them. Is there anything else that you'd share from a practical tip or strategy before we wrap up with the last question?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, so Charlie Kirk, when he was assassinated, mm-hmm. This turned into a huge, blow up on something small that I didn't think was really going to blow things up. But, I thought, okay, I should post something about this. I feel something about this. I should post something about this. And my post was aimed at saying, look, we don't have to agree with somebody to say this is not right. Mm-hmm. Assassination is not right. There's something sick or broken in our society, and to grieve for this person's death. And, 31-year-old young man who dies, who's, his wife, his children, all of that. And so I posted something, but as I posted it, I said, though I disagreed with Charlie Kirk on many things, this is horrible, and I grieve for him and for his family and people got really upset. Why did you have to say, though I disagree with him on many things up front? And, I had to stop, and I thought, I didn't have to say that. Or I could have said that. There are certain things that he'd said that I want people to know, okay, we don't agree on this thing, but I didn't have to say that right then. And it took me, I was out to dinner. I didn't see the whole firestorm on the social media until later on, a couple hours later. And it was one of our members who I really respect. He's on the more conservative side, but the right of center probably on some things, and maybe left center. I don't know. Anyway, but he sent me a note and he said, "Hey, I'm disappointed in the fact you wrote that." And I'm like, I really take this guy seriously. I really love him, and I had to look at it again and go, I see how that came across. That I had to make a statement about disagreeing with him as opposed to just saying this is wrong, and so I changed that. I changed it, and I made a little comment at the bottom so people would know what I had changed, because once you edit something on social media, then they can decide what they thought you said that you didn't really say. Yeah. And but here's one of the things. And so I met with this guy. I said, "Hey, why don't you come in? Let's talk." And so as we sat and talked, and I had a chance to hear where he was coming from, and he said, "I just think you felt like you were in a hurry to have to post something." And it would have been better for you if you just waited a couple hours and thought about it longer. And you know what? He was right. That I needed to just slow down and not needed. And I think this is, again, the problem we have with social media today is we feel like we're going to instantaneously respond to somebody's comments. And there were a whole lot of comments that were, I didn't read all of them, but posted on my deal like, I hope tomorrow morning you wake up and go, should I have really said that way to my pastor? Probably not. But it's the way we are. We just immediately fire off, and that's unhealthy. And so you asked, what else would you say? I'd say, slow down. Slow down. I try to do that. Most of the time I do that. If there's a news story that gets me angry, I'm gonna slow down, not post immediately. I want to find out the rest of the facts. I want to do a little more fact checking before I'm going to make a comment on that particular thing. And I'm going to try to hear it from the perspective of the other side. And I think that may help us. And at the same time, we need to be able to say, with love and compassion, I think this is wrong. I have protested. I've stood with signs at various times over the last 35 years. I understand. I was irritated when I heard, or frustrated when I heard people say, and again, even the quotes weren't accurate about House Speaker Johnson, these people who are holding up signs or Antifa or whatever. Well, that's not exactly what he said either. But there was this idea that the people holding up signs were, and that got spread around, Antifa, Hamas, whatever. And it's like all the people I saw were, some of the folks I knew were grandparents who just are worried about our country and saying, we need to reclaim an approach to politics and to our common life that's listening to people on both sides and not just one side charging forward. And anyway, I thought I appreciated the fact that they were out there willing to say, hey, but they were doing it, at least the folks I saw, in a way that represented, they were having fun. They were, being positive. And I'm sure there were people who were not, but the folks I saw were. And I think there's a place that we have to be able to stand up and say. And from the pulpit, when I'm preaching, I'm always asking this question. When I speak about something that's going to be a challenging or controversial issue, things are controversial because large numbers of people disagree. And so if the people on both sides think they're right. So if you have a way of trying to understand what people are thinking on both sides, and this is something I focused on in my first book I ever wrote, was called Confronting the Controversies. And I looked at the most controversial issues of our time. And at that point, abortion was the most controversial issue, and in the public's arena in the year 2000, and 2000 I think it was. And what I found is it was actually possible that you could meet with people who were, quote, pro-life and pro-choice, and there were a lot of places where they could agree, and there were some places where they couldn't agree. And if you could focus on, here's the places we can agree, and how do I take into account your truth as I'm holding my position and my convictions? And I think that's a healthier way of moving us forward.
As you're talking, if we had to put a tagline on it, sounds like a summary could be pause and think before you post.
Well, that is a great summary line. I think that's exactly right, Matt.
Awesome. Kind of last question here and then you can, as you take us home at the end of the episode, is how do we hold on to hope and peace when the news feels overwhelming and the problems feel too big? Where do we find that? How does faith play a role? Yeah,
I think faith plays a huge role in that because, first of all, when it comes to faith, we remember that God is ultimately the authority of all things. There is a God who created all things. We have an opportunity to use our free will to do good or evil. And I think it was Martin Luther King, maybe the arc of history, tends towards justice, or whatever the quote was.
Towards justice.
Bends towards justice. Yes. I mean, you look across history, and evil ultimately always falls. Justice tends to prevail, and we may not see it in the short term, but in the long term. Our lives and this world belong to God, and I also believe that people generally who are striving to do what's right and just are ultimately going to prevail in what's happening in our society in any given situation over time. Also, we live in a country where if you don't like what's going on, you get to vote again. So in 2026, if you don't like the way things are now, get out and vote in 2026 for something different. If you do like the way things are, you better get out and vote. And so, these are all, I think we can have hope And we can, and when you do feel hopeless, I think you say, what's mine to do? How do I go out and how do I create? How do I influence and how do I lead for a more just world or a more loving world or a world that's, and I think that's the critical thing for me. When government or people or policies are harming people, somebody has to speak up, right? And Proverbs 31 talks about, speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. We have to be able and willing to make our voices heard. And for me, we could disagree on a lot of things when it comes to politics, and the big government, a little government, taxation. There's a whole lot of things we can disagree upon. They're all moral issues, in my opinion, or almost all of them are moral issues. But when it comes to people being harmed, there's we have to be able to say this is not okay. And so I find as a pastor of a church that's divided, Republican, Democrat, Independent, you never say enough for the people who want you to say more, and you say too much for the people who don't want you to say anything, and trying to figure out how to say anything in a way that invites people to engage their own minds and hearts without telling them this is what you have to believe or else. You tell them that and they're not with you, and they just leave and go find another church where they can find somebody who agrees with them from the pulpit. But if you can hold people together saying, and people say, I don't agree with Adam on this or that, but I really appreciate his heart, and I know that he values me even though I'm not on the same side as he is on this issue or that issue or politics. I think that is that's a win. So
awesome. Well, that's all the questions that I
Matt,
had for you today.
Thank you so much for coming with your questions. We're going to do this again, and I know you've got a whole set of questions on a variety of topics, but I want to thank you for your role in producing the Making Sense of Faith podcast and thinking about these things. I want to thank you for joining us, and really grateful that you are part of the Making Sense of Faith podcast. I want to encourage you to join us again. We cover a wide range of topics, whether it has to do, last episode was marriage. This one we're talking about, last episode was why church, then marriage, then, talking about this and theological questions coming up. But join us, and if you have appreciated the podcast, share it with your friends. And God bless you. Have a great day.
Thanks for tuning in to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. Do you know someone wrestling with life's biggest questions? Share this episode with them. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell to catch future episodes and videos there. We'll see you on the next episode of Making Sense of Faith.